Hello, my name is Al Bader. Welcome to my presentation as part of the semester project for PHS 611, Logic and Epistemology. The title of my presentation is Kantian Transcendental Idealism and Epistemological Realism. We will begin with a brief introduction to the concepts of epistemological realism and idealism. Author Kenneth Gallagher, in The Philosophy of Knowledge, defines the concept of epistemological realism as the position that holds that my consciousness puts me in touch with what is other than myself, and that my act of perceiving reaches this object just as it is in itself. So what we find is that this position, one who holds this position believes that knowledge is that of objects, and these objects have independent, permanent existence outside of any acts of our perception. Moving into epistemological idealism, Gallagher writes that it's the position that holds that every act of knowing terminates in an idea, which is a purely subjective event. So what we find as a conclusion of this position is that knowledge is that of internal concepts of objects, not the objects themselves, as we would find in one who holds epistemological realism to be their position. And the issue with idealism, which will be addressed further on in this presentation, is that it's a position that creates a potential divide between the mind and the external world. It's a subjectivist position, potentially. With the notions of epistemological realism and idealism defined and explained as such, I will transition to an exposition of the Kantian notion of transcendental idealism, the Kantian system. And the root of this system, the root of the transcendental idealism, is what's known as the formal categories of the understanding. And Gallagher, once again, writing on Kant and his position, writes that experience arises with the raw material of sensations. But the senses alone do not give us objects. For this, the raw material of sensations must be folded by the formal categories of the understanding. Moving on to the concept of knowledge and how transcendental idealism relates to knowledge, Gallagher writes that I only have genuine knowledge in respect to what is an object, and that the complete meaning of object is a synthesis of sense, intuition, and formal concept. So what we find between these two quotes relating to the formal categories of the understanding, knowledge, and objects, we find that the object is a combination of both sense, intuition, and these concepts. So sense intuition itself and sense experience as it appears to us is not enough to form the objects. The object is formed when the formal categories of the understanding mold the sense experience into something that is understandable to the brain, to the human consciousness. And it's important to note that these categories, these formal categories, are only pure forms or rules according to which things can be laid hold of. So what this means is that any attempt to use these categories outside of any sense experience, it yields nothing, it provides us nothing, which is further testament to the notion that you need both the formal categories and sense intuition, sense experience. The synthesis of the two creates the object that we can then have knowledge of. Continuing on, two additional concepts that are critical to the system of transcendental idealism are that of the noumena and the phenomena. So beginning with the noumena, commonly referred to as the thing in itself, it's defined as reality in itself, apart from all relation to consciousness, and the trans-experiential objective ground of my experiencing things the way I do. And what's unique about the noumena is that we can't say anything about it since it's trans-experiential. It's beyond what we're capable of experiencing. We can't have knowledge of it. So what do we have? We have the phenomena. And the phenomena is defined as reality as it presents itself to consciousness. Gallagher writes that reality as it presents itself to a knower must then present itself according to the conditions under which he can know. And this relates to the formal categories of the understanding previously discussed. So what we find is that everything present to our experience is phenomenal. None of it is noumenal. And that means that everything present to us is present to us according to the conditions of our knowing. And Kant focuses specifically on the a priori forms of understanding to include space, time, and cause. And what that means is that anything that we can know about reality, we must know according to space, time, and cause. The conditions of our experiencing are spatially, temporally, and via causality. Now, the object of contention here is the notion that the objects of our experience are real, but they're only phenomenally real. So that's what we're going to dig into now is what is meant by phenomenally real. Do these objects truly exist, or do they exist only in our heads? At this point, I'd like to introduce an article titled Criticism of Kant by authors Fisher and Howe. And written in this article, consistent with our previous findings, is that transcendental idealism holds that all our phenomena or objects of experience are mere ideas. However, we are only concerned with the objective phenomena, the things external to us, the phenomena in space, hence bodies or matter. Now, what these two authors introduce in their article is that there exists a contention between the various editions of Kant's critique of pure reason, relating to the notions of empirical idealism and realism, separate from epistemological idealism and realism. So in the first edition, Kant writes that it is clearly shown that if I should take away the thinking subject, the entire material world would disappear, since it is nothing but the appearance in the sensibility of the subject and a sort of ideas. Now this quote is pretty cut and dry empirical idealism. This is, as Kant himself describes, as dogmatic and problematic. And what that means is that objects, the external world, simply does not exist. The only thing that exists is our mental concepts, our representations of the external world. However, he switches gears in the second edition and clarifies in a refutation against this empirical idealism, writing that thus the perception of this persistence is only possible through a thing external to me, and not through the mere idea of such a thing. And what this quote is indicative of empirical realism, the position that states that objects external to us, the external world, does truly exist. So what Kant's saying here in the second edition is that our perception, our phenomena that we generate, is only possible if external things actually existed in reality, external objects, an external world existed. So how does Kant go about proving the existence of this external world? Well, it's proved through a relationship of dependence and independence. And Fisher writes that Kant made inner experience dependent upon outer, and outer experience dependent upon the existence of external things. That is, he made the existence of external things independent of our thought, and the latter dependent on the former. And what this quote's getting at is the notion that external objects exist independently of our thought, but at the same time, our thoughts are dependent upon the existence of external objects. So we have a relationship here of independence and dependence. And this is reminiscent of the Cartesian proof seen by Descartes in his work of the Meditations. Fisher writes that our ideas of bodies in this Cartesian system was only possible under the condition of the existence of bodies independent of our ideas. So what we have here is the idea that in order to have an idea of external matter, well, external matter must exist independent of the mind. And what this proof does, the combination of the Cartesian aspect and the Kantian aspect, it proves that existence of things in themselves are noumena. And these noumena are that which provide us with our sensations that create phenomena. So we've seen that Kant wishes to take the position of empirical realism, that the external world truly exists. The question at hand now is whether or not this is consistent with the system of transcendental idealism. And the answer is yes. The existence of external objects remains consistent with transcendental idealism. That is because noumena, the things in themselves, exist, and the combination of the sense experience that we receive from these noumena and the categories of our understanding creates the phenomena, and the phenomena are thus the objects of our knowledge. So empirical realism is consistent. Moreover, it's necessary. What Fisher continues to write is that transcendental idealism teaches the origin of our common phenomenal world. Empirical realism teaches that there are accordingly no other objects of knowledge but phenomena, or sensible things. We find that transcendental idealism and empirical realism necessarily go together. You can't have one without the other. They form a harmonious relationship, and one who is a transcendental idealist must necessarily be an empirical realist, and vice versa. Returning to the initial discussion on epistemological idealism and realism, as well as summarizing what we've spoken about, we come to the conclusion that transcendental idealism, for Kant, is incompatible with the position of epistemological realism. And that's because, as we've seen, the noumena, we simply have no knowledge of it. We have no knowledge of the thing in itself. Epistemological realism, as we've seen, states that the objects of our knowledge are the objects themselves, and as such, transcendental idealism cannot be an epistemological realist position. And returning to the introduction and the notion of subjectivity, Gallagher writes that the ideas that we have, the objects of our knowledge, are modifications of an individual mind, and hence subjective. Epistemological idealism is defined above as hence equivalent to subjectivism. So we've seen that transcendental idealism is not an epistemologically realist position, therefore it's an epistemologically idealist position. And introducing the article Epistemology in Locke and Kant by author Andrew Seth, Seth writes that our knowledge of things may be imperfect and colored by the infusion of subjective elements. But if there were no things in themselves, the whole process of knowing would be a completely unmotivated excursion into the void. And this ominous sentence presents us with a double-edged sword, right? Because without the existence of external objects, the pursuit of knowledge would be impossible. But with the existence of external objects, as unknowable, inherently unknowable in themselves, we come to the conclusion that knowledge must take on some sort of subjective element. What does Kant say about subjectivism in his own work? What is his proposed solution to this problem? Well, Seth writes that Kant's way out of the difficulty, therefore, was, in effect, to renounce the attempt to know the real objects and rest content with the subjective modifications of his own sensibility. And what that quote implies is that the entire scope of our cognition, what we're able to know, is limited to our subjective phenomena. So what we find is that Kant does not provide a solution to subjectivism. Rather, he simply accepts it. He becomes content with it. And moving on to the idea of experience, Seth writes that adopting the favorite Kantian expression, we might say that experience, just because it is experienced, is eo ipso a subjective fact. Immediately, of course, my experience is the only means I possess of passing beyond my individual subjectivity to the transsubjective universe of other men and things. But in its immediacy, it cannot bridge the gulf between the subjective and the transsubjective. So the position that we find ourselves in is that there appears to be some sort of ambiguity in the Kantian framework of transcendental idealism. How does our experience, which is immediately subjective to us, transcend this subjectivity to become fully and truly objective? How do we arrive at objective knowledge if all of our experience is inherently subjective? Moving into our summary, our points of clarification, and our final thoughts, we find that the system of transcendental idealism claims epistemological idealism, but not empirical idealism. And conversely, that it claims empirical realism, but not epistemological realism. Continuing on to the concept of knowledge, we discuss that the objects of our knowledge, our phenomena, are the result of the synthesis of sense experience with the formal concepts of our understanding. And that the knowledge of the noumena, the things in themselves, is in and of itself impossible, but that their existence is a necessary prerequisite for knowledge of phenomena. One final note on the notion of subjectivity, we found that phenomena are inherently subjective, and that Kant's framework remains in a state of ambiguity regarding how phenomena are able to surpass subjectivity and achieve objectivity. In a final note from Seth, he writes, in themselves as perceptions, they are still subjective, still modes of my consciousness. Their objectivity is an immanent or subjective objectivity of independently existing things. Now, this statement remains curious, as we find that perceptions are both objective and subjective, and more research is necessary to come to a definitive conclusion. However, with that being said, we cannot deny the significance of the system of transcendental idealism and its impacts on the history of philosophy. The bibliography that lists the references utilized throughout the course of this presentation is on the screen currently. If there are any questions, please feel free to leave a comment on this blog post or send me an email. Thank you.